Charleston, South Carolina, was a city where the darkest secrets often hid behind the pristine facades of colonial mansions. Grace Johnson knew this better than anyone. The 33-year-old worked as a housekeeper in the Grand Mason family home, one of the most influential in town. During the day, she cleaned, organized, and kept the house immaculate. But at night, the walls of that house harbored another kind of secret. Grace had never planned to get involved with Andrew Mason. At first, he was just her boss, a 47-year-old white man, respected by many, with an elegant wife and well-behaved children. But over time, glances were exchanged, seemingly innocent conversations dragged on, and soon, the nighttime meetings became inevitable. One night, while tidying up Andrew's office, he entered silently, as he always did. Closing the door behind him, he approached Grace and, without hesitation, enveloped her in an embrace. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered, sliding his fingers down her arm. Grace pulled back slightly, trying to stay focused on her work. "Andrew, this can't keep happening," she murmured, looking down. She always felt conflicted during these moments. Andrew pulled her back, insistent. "You know I can't stay away from you, Grace." His voice was low but filled with certainty. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what they were doing. She knew it was wrong, not just because he was married, but also because of the power he held over her life. If things went wrong, she had nowhere to turn. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the attraction she felt. There was a connection between them, however complicated it was. "And if someone finds out," she asked, breaking the silence, "I'd lose my job. And you, your reputation, your family?" Andrew chuckled softly, a laugh that always seemed cold and indifferent. "No one will find out, Grace. I take care of everything. I always do." She wanted to believe. For a while, she believed she could control what she felt. But the reality of such an unequal relationship was clear. Grace knew that to Andrew, she was a secret he kept well hidden, something he concealed from the outside world. And so, that night, as Charleston slept in its usual calm, Grace and Andrew continued to meet in the shadows, trapped in a relationship neither of them dared to acknowledge publicly. But life doesn't always follow the plan they had in mind. Grace Johnson's days began to change. The routine of waking up early, catching the bus to the Mason estate, cleaning the rooms, and preparing dinner seemed the same as always, but something inside her felt different. First came the dizziness. Then, the intense nausea. At first, Grace thought it was just fatigue or something she ate. But when her period was weeks late, she started to feel a chill down her spine. Could it be? Deep down, Grace already knew. But she still went to the farthest pharmacy from her home to buy a pregnancy test, trying to avoid being seen by anyone she knew. Back at her tiny apartment, she locked herself in the bathroom. The silence in the room felt suffocating as she waited for the result. When she finally looked at the test, the two red lines that appeared confirmed what she feared. She was pregnant. The revelation was a shock, and tears quickly filled her face. Sitting on the cold bathroom floor, Grace hugged herself, thinking about what it all meant. How would she tell Andrew? How could she have a child with a man who would never publicly acknowledge their relationship, let alone a biracial child? She spent the night awake, wrestling with fear and uncertainty. The next day, she decided she needed to tell Andrew. She couldn't keep it a secret forever. But the fear of what he might say overwhelmed her. When she saw him at the Mason house that night, she hesitated. He was sitting in his office, a glass of whiskey in hand, reading a newspaper. Everything seemed so normal, while her life was about to turn upside down. "Andrew, I need to talk to you," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up, curious but nonchalant. "Sure, Grace. What's up?" His expression was one of indifference, something she was already familiar with. Grace took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed good enough to soften the blow. I'm pregnant," she said all at once, her voice sounding louder than she intended. An oppressive silence filled the room. For a moment, Andrew was motionless, as if processing what he had just heard. Then his face changed. The relaxed demeanor was replaced by shock and anger. "What?" He slammed the whiskey glass on the table. How How did this happen? Grace bit her lip, feeling small under his gaze. It happened, Andrew. I'm pregnant, and it's yours. He stood up suddenly, pacing back and forth in the office. This is insane. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. Do you have any idea what this means? A child? This can't happen. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. Andrew, I didn't plan this, but it's the reality now. We need to talk about what we're going to do. He stopped abruptly, turning to her with eyes full of frustration. There is no we, Grace. You need to get rid of it. A child? A black child? This would be the end for me. Do you understand what this means? He rubbed his face, almost as if trying to erase the thought from his mind. Grace stood still, her heart breaking with every word he said. The pain of hearing black, treated as something shameful, was unbearable. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held her ground. So that's it? She asked, her voice breaking. You want me to disappear with this child as if nothing ever happened? Andrew didn't answer immediately. He looked at Grace, and for a moment, something like remorse flickered in his eyes. But he quickly regained his composure. Yes, that's it. This can never exist, Grace. She felt a wave of despair and anger surge through her. Without saying anything more, she turned and left the office, leaving Andrew behind. As she closed the door, Grace knew she would be completely alone from that moment on. The reality was harsh, but her decision was made. She would keep the baby, no matter what. Days blurred for Grace. She continued going to work, but everything felt different. The feeling of being watched, of carrying a secret that was suffocating her, became overwhelming. The relationship with Andrew, once a confusing mix of desire and guilt, was now something much clearer. There were no more doubts about how he truly saw her, or about the future he wanted for them, or rather, the lack of future. Finally, after a week of tense silence, Grace decided to confront him again. She needed a definitive answer. She still hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy, and the pressure of handling everything alone was becoming unbearable. That night, when Andrew came home after yet another long day at the office, Grace was waiting for him in the hallway. He stopped in his tracks, a mixture of surprise and irritation on his face. Grace, what are you doing here? He said in a low, firm tone, already suspecting what she wanted. We need to talk, she said, crossing her arms to maintain her composure. Andrew sighed, clearly annoyed by the turn of events. He led her into the office and shut the door behind them. We have nothing more to discuss, Grace, he began bluntly. I've made my position clear on this. Grace felt a surge of anger rise within her. It was as if he was completely ignoring the gravity of what had happened between them. Do you think this can just be erased, Andrew? Her voice was trembling but determined. I'm pregnant with your child. We can't pretend this doesn't exist. We need to decide what we're going to do. Andrew gave a short, almost bitter laugh and moved away, walking to the window to look out over the vast garden of his mansion. I've already decided, Grace, he said without turning to face her. You need to get rid of it. There's no other option. She felt the impact of his words like a punch to the stomach. Even though she knew he wouldn't react well, hearing it so coldly and directly was devastating. You really want me to get rid of our child? She asked, her eyes welling up with tears. How can you be so cruel? Andrew finally turned to face her, his eyes now stern and full of impatience. Don't make this personal, Grace. This isn't about you or me. It's about my family, my reputation. A biracial child. Do you understand what that would do to me? I'd be ruined. Grace looked at him in disbelief. The man she had known for so long now seemed like a stranger, so consumed by his status and image that he couldn't see the humanity in the situation. Is that all that matters to you? Grace replied, her voice now filled with hurt. Your reputation? What about the baby? What about me? Do you think you can just erase this because it doesn't fit into your perfect life? Andrew frowned, clearly impatient. He didn't want to have this conversation, much less acknowledge his part in it. You knew what this was from the beginning, Grace, he retorted. There were no promises. There was no future. You knew that. She looked at him, trying to control the anger she felt. She knew there was no future for them, but she had hoped he would be at least a little more human. Andrew, I'm not asking you to abandon everything. I just want you to take responsibility. This baby is your child too. You can't just abandon me like this." He ran his hands through his hair, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "I can't, Grace. I can't do that," he replied, his voice now lower. "It would be a disgrace for me, for my family. I've said it before, this can't exist." Grace felt her heart shatter with his words. The man she thought she knew, with whom she had shared such intimate moments, was now completely indifferent to the life they had created together. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice coming out as a whisper, almost in disbelief. "You're leaving me alone in this?" Andrew looked at her with a mix of frustration and remorse, but his answer was clear. "Yes, Grace. That's it." Grace didn't say anything more. There were no words that could change what he had already decided. She turned and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she stopped and turned one last time. "I'm not getting rid of the baby," she said firmly, "and you can live with the guilt of turning your back on your own child." Without waiting for a response, Grace left the office and shut the door behind her. The tears she had been holding back fell heavily as she walked away from the house. She knew that from now on, she would be completely alone on this journey. The reality was painful, but at least now Grace knew she couldn't count on Andrew any longer. In the following days, Grace's life changed drastically. The void left by Andrew's rejection seemed to grow with every passing moment. She continued working at the mansion, but the atmosphere was now filled with tension and sadness. Grace hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy, not even her closest friends. She felt she needed time to process everything, but time was not on her side. Each day that passed made the presence of the baby more real, and the uncertainty of the future more overwhelming. That morning, while cleaning the kitchen in the Mason mansion, Andrew's footsteps echoed through the house. He had been away the past few days, probably avoiding her. Grace sighed when she heard his footsteps approaching. She knew they would have to face each other again eventually, but she wasn't ready. Andrew entered the kitchen, and the silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt the weight of his gaze on her as she scrubbed the sink more vigorously than necessary. "Grace." Andrew's voice was cold and direct. "We need to talk." Grace paused for a moment, not turning to face him. She knew this was coming. Finally, she set the cloth aside, took a deep breath, and turned to face him. "About what, Andrew?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she was trembling inside. Andrew crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He seemed tense, as if he were about to do something he didn't want to. "I spoke with a lawyer," he began bluntly. "We'll settle everything. You'll be compensated, financially, of course. But this needs to end, Grace. You need to understand that I can't take responsibility for any of this." Grace looked at him in disbelief. "A lawyer?" she repeated, not believing what she was hearing. "You think you can fix this with money? You think you can buy your own child's future and just disappear?" Andrew sighed, frustrated. "Grace, I'm trying to be practical. I can't let this ruin my life. But I don't want you to be left without support. I'm willing to help, financially. That's the most I can do." Grace shook her head, feeling the anger bubbling up inside her. "You think this is all about money?" she asked, her voice rising. "I'm not asking for your money, Andrew. I'm asking you to be a man, to take responsibility for what we did. This baby isn't just mine. It's yours too." Andrew stepped closer, trying to stay calm, but his impatience was evident. "And what do you want me to do, Grace?" he asked, his voice harsh. "Tell my wife? Throw everything away for something that never should have happened? You knew from the start this was just between us, that it would never leave these four walls." Grace felt a tightness in her chest hearing those words, but didn't let the tears fall. "I knew you wouldn't acknowledge it publicly," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But I never imagined you would reject your own child like this." Andrew sighed, visibly uncomfortable with the accusation. "I'm not rejecting," he said. "I'm trying to do what's best for all of us." Grace laughed, a bitter and painful laugh. "Best for you, maybe," she corrected. "But me? I'll raise this child alone. And your child will grow up without a father. Is that what you think is best?" Andrew remained silent, unable to respond. Grace shook her head, grabbed her bag, and walked towards the door. You know, Andrew, I really thought you were better than this, she said, glancing back at him one last time. But now I see that you were never anything more than a coward. She left the kitchen, leaving Andrew alone with his choices. As she walked away from the mansion, she felt a mix of sadness and relief. She knew she was on her own, but at least now there were no more illusions. She would face this alone, but she would face it with courage. Grace placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life growing inside her. "Don't worry, my baby," she whispered to herself. "I'll take care of you. We'll be okay." After her final confrontation with Andrew, Grace made a decisive choice. She couldn't keep working for the Mason family. Each passing day made the tension between her and Andrew more unbearable. The few words exchanged were cold and formal, and Grace knew her presence in the house was as uncomfortable for him as his presence was for her. She needed peace, a space where she could focus on herself and the life growing inside her. That morning, after another restless night, Grace packed her small suitcase. She put inside it the few clothes she had kept at the mansion, reminders of a time that now seemed like a lifetime ago. When she finished, she stood in front of the mirror, studying her reflection. The early signs of her pregnancy were still subtle, but for her, they were impossible to ignore. Her face looked more tired, but her eyes held a determination she hadn't felt before. She went down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the quiet house. Mrs. Mason had gone on a business trip and wouldn't return for a few days, giving Grace the chance to say goodbye without drama. Andrew was in his office, as usual, working in silence. She knew he wouldn't say goodbye. Before leaving, she encountered Sophie, the housekeeper, and one of the few people she had maintained a cordial relationship with. Sophie, a gray-haired lady with kind eyes, noticed the suitcase and furrowed her brow. "Grace, you're leaving?" Sophie asked, visibly surprised. "What's going on?" Grace hesitated for a moment. Part of her wanted to tell Sophie everything, to open her heart, but she knew that wasn't fair. Sophie was not to blame, and telling the truth would only complicate her life too. "Yes, Sophie. I think it's time for me to move on," Grace said, trying to smile. "I just need some time for myself." Sophie looked at her with concern, noticing the seriousness in Grace's voice. "If you need anything, my dear, you know where to find me. Don't hesitate to reach out, okay?" Sophie said, lightly touching Grace's arm with a caring gesture. "Thank you, Sophie. I really appreciate it." Grace shook the housekeeper's hand, feeling a wave of gratitude for that small moment of empathy. After the brief encounter with Sophie, Grace walked out the front door of the mansion. She paused for a moment, looking at the vast garden she had admired so many times during her days of work. But this time, as she looked at that imposing house, all she felt was a mix of relief and sadness. Leaving that place meant leaving behind all the pain and disappointment she carried with Andrew. As she was about to open the gate, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She stopped, already knowing who it was. "Grace, wait." Andrew's voice echoed down the path. She turned slowly, seeing him approach with a tense but determined expression. He stopped a few steps away, breathing heavily. "You're really leaving?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Grace looked at him. The man who once seemed so untouchable, now showing signs of desperation. "I am, Andrew. I can't stay here anymore," she said firmly, gripping the handle of her suitcase tightly. Andrew hesitated, as if struggling with his words. "This isn't what I want, Grace." Grace looked at him with a mix of pain and exhaustion. "And what do you want, Andrew?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Do you want me to stay here, pretending nothing happened? Do you want me to keep cleaning your house while you pretend our child doesn't exist?" Andrew remained silent, unable to meet her gaze directly. "I can't change who I am, Grace. I have responsibilities, a family, a reputation." He ran his hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "It's not as simple as you think." Grace laughed, a bitter laugh. "Yes, Andrew, I know you have a family, and now I will have one too. But the difference is that I'll take responsibility for mine while you choose to ignore yours." Andrew was silent, his words caught in his throat. He knew there was nothing more to say. She was right, and he knew it, but his cowardice prevented him from acting differently. "Goodbye, Andrew," Grace said, with deep sadness but a certainty that strengthened her. She turned and, without looking back, walked through the gate. With every step she took, she felt the weight of years of work, secrets, and hurt being left behind. She knew the future would be uncertain, but she also knew that, finally, she was in control of her own life. Grace walked through the streets of Atlanta, her heart heavy with the weight of an uncertain future. The sky was overcast, reflecting perfectly her emotional state. She found herself standing in front of a park, watching people pass by. Some laughed and played with their children, while others hurried to their daily commitments. To Grace, everything seemed distant, as if she were disconnected from the world around her. Holding her still small belly, she whispered to herself, "I'll figure it out. I promise I'll make a way for us." She knew she couldn't go back. There was no more illusory comfort of the financial security Andrew had provided. Now, she was alone. But at the same time, for the first time in a long time, Grace felt a kind of freedom she had never experienced before. She was free to make her own choices. Grace pulled out her phone and dialed the number of her best friend, Naomi, who lived in a small apartment on the west side of the city. Naomi had always been the pillar of her life, the only person Grace truly trusted. "Hello?" Naomi's warm voice answered, immediately recognizing the name on the screen. "Grace, how are you, girl? We haven't talked in days." Grace hesitated for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. "Naomi, I left the Mason house," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. I don't work there anymore." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Naomi responded, with a mix of surprise and concern. "What happened? You always said you needed that job. Did something go wrong?" Grace took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "A lot of things, Naomi. I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" "Of course." Naomi responded without hesitation. "Come over now. I'll make some coffee, and we'll sort everything out together, okay?" Grace smiled, feeling relieved to have someone she could trust. She knew Naomi would be direct, but she also knew Naomi wouldn't judge her. She took a bus, and in about 40 minutes, she was knocking on the door of Naomi's modest but welcoming apartment. "Come in," Naomi said with a wide smile as she opened the door. "You know there's always room for you here." Grace stepped inside and immediately felt the warmth and familiarity of the place. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and in the small living room, there were colorful cushions that Naomi loved to collect. "Sit down here," Naomi said, pointing to the couch. "Now tell me everything. What happened?" Grace sat down and, for a moment, remained silent, searching for the right words. Finally, she looked at Naomi and blurted it all out at once. "I'm pregnant, Naomi." Naomi's eyes widened, visibly shocked. She knew Grace had been through some tough times, but she hadn't expected this. "Pregnant? With Andrew Mason's baby?" Naomi asked, her voice full of disbelief. Grace nodded, and the tears she had been holding back began to fall. "Yes, and he fired me when I told him. He said I had to get rid of the baby because he would never claim the child, especially because it's black. He thinks it would ruin his life." The words came out bitter, laden with the contempt Andrew had shown. Naomi took a deep breath, processing what she had just heard. She looked at Grace with a mix of empathy and anger. "That bastard." Naomi shook her head, visibly enraged. "He used you, hurt you, and now he wants you to get rid of the baby? That's unacceptable, Grace. He has no right to treat you like that." Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand, feeling relief at finally having spoken about what was going on. "I know, Naomi, I know, but I can't rely on him. I can't wait for him to change or do the right thing. Now, it's all up to me." Naomi moved closer and took Grace's hands, looking directly into her eyes. "And you're strong enough for this, Grace. You always have been. This baby will get all the love and care it needs because you'll be the best mother there is. And whatever happens, I'm here with you. We'll get through this together." Grace smiled, feeling the warmth and support from her friend. Though she was still scared about what the future held, she knew that with Naomi's support, she wasn't entirely alone. "Thank you, Naomi." Grace squeezed her friend's hand with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Naomi smiled back. You'll figure out what to do, because that's what we do. We adapt, we survive, and we thrive. Now, have some coffee and let's start planning what comes next. You're not alone, Grace, and this baby will get all the love it deserves. Grace took a sip of the hot coffee, feeling a new wave of determination. She knew she still had a long road ahead, but with Naomi's support and her own inner strength, she was ready to face it. The following days were tough for Grace, but with Naomi by her side, she managed to keep hope alive. Her routine now involved searching for a new job, something that would allow her to support herself and the baby. Grace knew time was running out, and she needed stability, both financially and emotionally, before her child arrived. One afternoon, after yet another fruitless job search, Grace returned to Naomi's apartment exhausted. Naomi was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. "Any news?" Naomi asked, not needing to look up to sense her friend's disheartenment. "Nothing. It seems like no one wants to hire a pregnant woman," Grace replied, throwing her bag on the couch and sitting down with a sigh. "Things are tough enough, and when they realize I'm expecting, the answer is always the same: sorry, but we found someone else." Naomi frowned and set the knife aside, drying her hands with a dish towel. "That's ridiculous," she exclaimed, her frustration clear. "How can they judge someone for being pregnant? Like that makes you any less capable of doing the job." Grace smiled, appreciating her friend's passion. "I know, Naomi, but that's how it is. They see the belly and think I'll miss work every day or won't be able to do the job after the baby's born." Naomi sat down next to Grace on the couch, putting her arm around her friend's shoulders. "You'll find something, Grace. I know you will. And until then, you have a place here with me. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out." Grace took a deep breath, feeling a bit calmer. "Thanks, Naomi. I don't want to be a burden to you. I've been here for weeks and—" "Hey, cut that out," Naomi interrupted, shaking her head. "You'll never be a burden to me. We're family, remember? And family helps, without questioning." Grace smiled, feeling the warmth of their friendship. "I had an idea today while I was out," Grace said, changing the subject. "What if I started doing cleaning jobs again? It's something I know how to do well, and people always need help with their homes. It might not be glamorous, but it's work." Naomi nodded slowly. "That's not a bad idea. In fact, it might be exactly what you need right now. The hours would be more flexible, and you could be your own boss. Plus, you already have experience," she said, reflecting. "I know a few people who might need that kind of service. I can help spread the word." "That would be amazing," Grace said, her voice filled with renewed hope. "I can start with a small client base and, over time, expand. It might not be ideal, but at least it would be a steady income." Naomi smiled, pleased to see her friend perk up again. "That's right. You'll see, Grace. This baby will be born into an environment of love and care, and you'll be an incredible mother, no matter what." Grace nodded, feeling for the first time in a long while that there was a possible path ahead. Despite all the obstacles, she was determined to give her child a better life than what Andrew would have allowed. That night, as they had dinner together, Naomi took out her phone and began making some calls. "I'll see if I can find you some work this week. Some people around here have more money than common sense, so they'll probably want help with cleaning before a party or event," Naomi said, laughing lightly. "Maybe, with some luck, we'll get one of those socialites who love hiring extra help." Grace laughed too, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. "Who would have thought that, after everything, I'd be planning my life this way?" Grace commented. "When I left that mansion, I thought my world had ended. But now, I feel like I'm starting to find my way." "That's how it should be," Naomi said, her voice gentle. "You deserve better than that. Much better. And if you need a push, you know I'm here, right?" Grace smiled, squeezing her friend's hand. "I know, and I'm forever grateful for that." With her heart a little lighter, Grace knew the days of struggle were far from over, but she also knew she had the strength to face whatever came. She wasn't alone. With Naomi by her side and the prospect of a new beginning, the future seemed, for the first time in months, promising. Things started to fall into place for Grace, gradually. She secured her first cleaning clients with Naomi's help, which provided enough income to support herself, at least for the time being. However, even with small advances in her life, the past still haunted her. One day, while cleaning a house in an upscale neighborhood of Atlanta, Grace received an unexpected call. She was in the middle of arranging books on a shelf when her phone rang. Seeing Andrew flashing on the screen, her heart raced. It had been months since their last contact, and she didn't know what to expect. With trembling hands, she answered, "Andrew?" Her voice came out hesitantly, full of uncertainty. On the other end of the line, Andrew took a deep breath before responding. "Grace, I need to talk to you." Grace sat up straight, trying to keep her composure. "I'm not sure we have anything left to say to each other. You were pretty clear the last time we spoke." Her voice was cold, but there was a hint of pain hiding in her words. Andrew paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. I know what I did was awful, but things have changed. I wanted to talk, clear a few things up. Can we meet?" His voice sounded softer than Grace remembered, almost pleading. Grace gripped the phone tighter, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. She knew Andrew hadn't changed, and something about him always made her feel small. But at the same time, there was something inside her that wanted to hear what he had to say. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, Andrew. You hurt me more than anyone else ever has," she confessed, her voice faltering slightly as she recalled the moment he dismissed her as if she meant nothing. "Please, Grace, I just need a chance to explain," Andrew persisted. "I was an idiot. I was only thinking about myself, my image. But the truth is, I've been thinking about you every day." Grace closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Memories of their relationship surfaced, the intimate moments, the stolen smiles in the Mason house's hallways, the promises he never kept. "You've been thinking about me?" Grace asked, her voice full of disbelief. "I doubt it, Andrew. You dismissed me and told me to get rid of our baby as if it were an inconvenience. What could have changed since then?" Andrew was silent for a few moments, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. "I made a mistake. I can't change what I did, but I want to try to make things right, at least a little. I know I can't erase what I said, but I'm willing to take responsibility now." Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. He wanted to take responsibility? Where was this willingness when she needed it the most? Her mind raced, recalling the long nights she cried, the conversations with Naomi, the moments of desperation when she felt completely alone. "And what has changed, Andrew?" she asked, a mix of skepticism and pain in her voice. "Why suddenly, out of the blue, do you want to be responsible? What made you change your mind?" On the other end of the line, Andrew hesitated, and his response came in a whisper. "I don't know, Grace. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was guilt. I just know I can't keep living like this, pretending you and the baby don't exist." Grace squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back tears. The pain of abandonment was still fresh, but the idea that he somehow wanted to make amends confused her. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Andrew," she admitted softly. "Not after what you put me through." "I understand." He sighed. "But if you could at least let me see you and talk. I just need a chance to do things right." Grace was silent for a long time, her mind at war. Naomi had always told her to move on and not look back, but now, with Andrew trying to reconnect, she didn't know what to do. She had managed to build a life, however modest, without him, but at the same time, her heart still ached from the betrayal, and his words stirred up parts of her soul she thought she had moved past. "All right," she said reluctantly. "Let's meet. But know that I'm doing this for our child, not for you." "I understand," Andrew replied, almost relieved. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for giving me this chance. We'll see if you're worth it," she responded coldly before hanging up. Grace stood still for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. Andrew wanted to re-enter her life in some way, but she didn't know if he was being truthful or if this was just another one of his manipulations. That night, when she told Naomi about the call, her friend reacted with the same distrust Grace initially felt. "Grace, you know this guy is no good, right? He's already shown you who he is," Naomi said, her voice full of concern. "I know, but he's the father of my child. And what if he really has changed?" Grace pondered, though her voice was uncertain. "You've been through so much. You don't deserve to be hurt again." I just want you to be careful, Naomi warned, looking deeply into her friend's eyes. Grace nodded, knowing Naomi was right. But something inside her still wanted to believe that maybe Andrew had truly changed. The only way to find out was to give him one last chance. A chance that could either change everything or further destroy what was left of her trust. The day of the meeting with Andrew arrived, and Grace was nervous. She had chosen a quiet cafe in downtown Atlanta, a neutral spot where they could talk without interruptions. The aroma of fresh coffee and the low murmur of conversations in the background seemed to contrast with the whirlwind of emotions Grace felt. When Grace walked into the cafe, she saw Andrew sitting at a table in the corner. He was in a suit, a sight that seemed out of place in the cafe's casual setting. Grace took a deep breath and approached, trying to keep her composure. Andrew stood up when he saw her and smiled, but the smile looked forced. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, a gesture Grace avoided with a slight movement of recoil. Grace. Andrew's voice was filled with nervousness. Thank you for coming. Let's get straight to the point, Andrew, Grace said as she sat down at the table. I don't want to waste time with pleasantries. Why did you want to meet? Andrew nodded, seeming to recognize the seriousness in Grace's voice. I understand. I just need to explain a few things. First, I want to apologize. I was an idiot. I treated you badly and made terrible choices. I was so focused on maintaining my image that I couldn't see beyond myself. Grace looked at him, her eyes hard. And why, suddenly, have you decided you need to take responsibility? What has changed since then? Andrew sighed and looked down, as if searching for the right words. I can't stop thinking about what I did. Every day, I wonder how I could have been so insensitive. And recently, I've come to realize that if I keep ignoring what I did, I won't be able to move on. I want to try to make things right, at least in part. Grace crossed her arms, clearly skeptical. And what exactly are you willing to do? Because just saying you're sorry doesn't change the fact that you abandoned me and tried to erase our child from your life. Andrew looked directly at Grace, his gaze filled with nervous determination. I want to be present for the baby. I'm not saying everything will be like before, but I want to try to help in some way. I want to contribute financially and, if you allow it, be involved in my child's life. I know I can't erase the past, but I want to show that I can be responsible now. Grace shook her head, a mix of emotions crossing her face. And what makes you think I'll let you be involved after everything that's happened? She asked, the pain still evident in her voice. You have no idea what I went through alone. Andrew leaned forward, his look pleading. I know, and I can't change what happened, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show that I'm committed to this. I want to be part of the baby's life. I want to genuinely help, not just offer an apology. Grace fell silent, her emotions in turmoil. Part of her wanted to believe that Andrew might be telling the truth, but she was deeply hurt and distrustful. I need to think about it, she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. I can't make a decision right now, not after everything you've put me through. Andrew nodded, his expression resigned. I understand. I just hope you'll see that I'm trying. I'll wait as long as it takes. What's important is that I want to be part of our child's life, if you allow me to. Grace took a deep breath, feeling a weight on her chest. She knew she needed to consider what was best for the baby, which meant evaluating whether Andrew had really changed, or if this was just another attempt at manipulation. I'll think about it, Grace said, standing up to leave. And please, don't contact me until I tell you. I need time. Andrew also stood up, his gaze sad and remorseful. Agreed. I hope you find peace, Grace. And please remember that I'm trying to do the right thing now. Grace turned and walked out of the cafe, feeling emotionally drained. Her meeting with Andrew had brought up many unresolved issues and left her with a mix of hope and uncertainty. As she walked home, she thought about what would be best for her child. Her decision wouldn't just be about what was easiest or seemed right at the moment, but what would truly benefit the baby that was about to be born. She needed time to process and decide what was best for both herself and her child. That night, as she talked to Naomi about the meeting, she felt her friend's support like an anchor in the midst of her emotional storm. So, he wants to be involved, Naomi said, her tone encouraging. But you don't have to make any decisions right now. The important thing is that you're okay, and that the baby gets what it needs. And remember, no matter what Andrew does, you have a support network here. Grace smiled, feeling a sense of relief from Naomi's words. She knew the road ahead would be complicated, but at least she had someone by her side to help her navigate the turbulent waters of life. And with that, Grace prepared to face the future challenges, determined to do her best for her child and herself. The following month passed with a mix of ups and downs for Grace. She landed several cleaning contracts, which helped provide a steady income. Although there were still moments of discouragement and fatigue, Grace was determined to do her best for her baby. Her belly was beginning to show visible signs of pregnancy, and she prepared for the birth with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. On a particularly busy day, Grace returned to Naomi's small apartment after a long day of work. She was exhausted, but there was still a sense of accomplishment in having managed to support herself and the baby. Naomi was in the living room, reading a book and sipping a cup of tea. "Hey, how was work today?" Naomi asked, looking up from her book. Grace dropped her bag on the sofa and sat down next to Naomi, letting out a tired sigh. "It was exhausting, as always," Grace replied, rubbing her shoulders, "but at least I'm seeing results. People are happy with my work." Naomi smiled, offering Grace a cup of tea. "You're doing an amazing job, Grace. It's not easy, but you're handling it very well. And I was thinking, maybe it's time for you to start thinking about preparing the baby's room. It's good to start getting organized." Grace took a sip of tea and nodded. "I've been thinking about it, but I don't have much space and money is tight. I just want the best for the baby, but sometimes it's hard to know where to start." Naomi frowned, thinking for a moment. "Well, maybe we can do something together. I have some old furniture you can use. And maybe we can organize a small baby shower to collect a few things. A lot of people like to help, and it could be a good opportunity to get some essential items." Grace smiled, touched by Naomi's generosity. "That would be amazing. I'd really appreciate any help you can offer." Naomi nodded and stood up, starting to look for some furniture boxes in the closet. "I'll start preparing the things I have stored. It won't be anything too elaborate, but it will help create a comfortable space for the baby. And as for the baby shower, I'll start planning that too." As Naomi organized the furniture, Grace sat and watched, feeling grateful for the support. Naomi's generosity was a constant source of support in her life. However, as the day went on, a feeling of unease settled in Grace. Her meeting with Andrew still weighed heavily on her mind, and the idea of allowing him back into their lives was beginning to seem even more complex. She knew she couldn't delay her decision forever, but the uncertainty consumed her. Later that week, Grace was at home, preparing a list of items for the baby shower, when the phone rang. It was Andrew, and Grace's anxiety spiked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Andrew." Her voice was cautious. "Hi, Grace. I've been thinking about how we can make this work. Do you have any ideas on how I can help more, beyond just financial support? I want to be more involved." Grace took a deep breath, trying to control the tension in her voice. "Well, actually, I'm still thinking about how I'd like things to go. It's not just about money. It's about having someone who is genuinely committed. I don't want you to just show up when it's convenient for you." Andrew seemed to understand the seriousness of what Grace was saying. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show that I'm committed. I can help set up the baby's room, if that helps, and I'll be available for anything you need." Grace hesitated, weighing her words. "That would be a good start. And, if possible, I'd like to know more about how you plan to be involved in the future. I don't want this to be just a temporary solution." Andrew agreed. "Understood. I'll make sure you see that I'm here to stay and that I'm doing this the right way." After hanging up the phone, Grace sat in silence for a few minutes, reflecting on the conversation. She knew there was still a long way to go before she could be sure that Andrew had truly changed, but at least he was showing a willingness to try. In the following days, Grace and Naomi began working on preparing the baby's room. Naomi brought over some furniture and decorations, and Grace started to feel that, despite the challenges, something positive was emerging. The baby shower was organized and went off successfully. The small party was a welcome relief, filled with laughter and support from friends and family. Although the event didn't raise much money, it brought a sense of community and solidarity that Grace had missed. At the end of the party, While helping Naomi clean up, Grace looked at the baby's room and smiled. You know, Naomi, even though I'm far from where I imagined being, I'm grateful to have you here. It's hard to believe that things can get better, but I feel like I'm starting to see a new perspective. Naomi smiled, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. You're doing your best, Grace. And even though the path is tough, you're doing it with courage and strength. And remember, no matter what happens, you're never alone in this. Grace nodded, feeling a bit lighter. The journey was still far from over, but with Naomi's support and Andrew's sincere attempt, she began to glimpse a new hope for the future. Time passed, and the baby was getting close to term. Grace felt the tension and anticipation growing each day. The baby's room was nearly ready, thanks to Naomi's support, and life seemed to be settling into a new routine. One morning, while Grace was at Naomi's apartment helping organize some things for the baby, Andrew showed up at the door, carrying a box of baby items. He looked visibly nervous, which didn't go unnoticed by Grace. "Hi, Andrew," Grace greeted, trying to keep her tone neutral. "What did you bring?" Andrew smiled timidly, placing the box on the table. "I brought some things I bought for the baby. I wanted to make sure you had what you needed before the birth. I also have some other things in the car." Grace looked at the box with a mix of surprise and skepticism. There were baby clothes, toys, and essential items. "I appreciate the gesture, but," Grace began, her voice hesitant, "are you really committed to this?" Andrew looked at her with sincerity, trying to convey his intention. "I know I can't change the past, Grace, but I want to show that I'm committed. I want to be present and genuinely help. If there's anything else I can do, please let me know." Grace took a deep breath, feeling a mix of gratitude and skepticism. She knew Andrew's presence was important for the baby, but she also needed to see consistent actions to fully trust him. "Well, since you're here, maybe you can help me set up the crib and organize a few things. I could use an extra pair of hands." Andrew nodded, apparently relieved to have something concrete to do. "Sure, let's do that." As they worked together to set up the crib and organize the room, there was a subtle tension in the air. Andrew tried to be helpful and attentive, while Grace observed every action with a critical eye. "I've been thinking," Grace said, breaking the silence as she adjusted the mattress in the crib, "about how you can be involved in the future. I want to make sure you're really ready for this." Andrew stopped what he was doing and turned to Grace. "I understand. I don't want you to have any doubts. I'm willing to be an active part of our baby's life, not just when it's convenient for me. I want to be a present father." Grace paused, looking at him. "So, what does that mean to you? How do you plan to be involved, beyond offering financial support and being available when I need you?" Andrew thought for a moment before answering. "I want to be involved in every way possible. I'll attend medical appointments, help with feeding, change diapers, everything you need. I want to be more than just an occasional presence. I want to be there for the important milestones in our child's life." Grace listened carefully, evaluating his words. She was starting to see that Andrew was making a sincere effort, but she still had reservations. "We'll see how things unfold," she replied, trying to keep her tone balanced. "I really hope you're serious about this." The crib assembly was completed, and Grace looked around the room, which was starting to take shape. Andrew's efforts seemed genuine, but there was still a part of her that worried about what the future might hold. "Thanks for helping today," Grace said, her voice a little softer. "I really appreciate the gesture." Andrew smiled, feeling satisfied. "You're welcome. I'm here to help with whatever you need. And please, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call me." That night, as Grace prepared for bed, she talked with Naomi about the progress with Andrew. Naomi listened attentively, her expression concerned. "So, he's trying. That's a good sign. But don't forget to be cautious," Naomi advised. "Don't let the need for financial support or the desire to believe in change blind you. What matters is the stability and well-being of the baby." Grace nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in Naomi's words. "I know, and I'll keep that in mind. I just want to do what's best for the baby and make sure we have a solid foundation." Naomi put a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You're doing an amazing job, and no matter how things turn out, you have a support network here to help you." Grace smiled, feeling comforted. With Naomi's help and Andrew's sincere effort, she was beginning to build a future for her child. But even with these positive steps, Grace knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges. She needed to keep evaluating and adapting, always prioritizing her baby's well-being and maintaining her own emotional stability. As she prepared to face the next chapter of her life, Grace felt a mix of hope and caution. She was taking important steps, but she knew the journey was far from over. The big day finally arrived. The sun was beginning to rise over Atlanta, casting a soft light through the hospital windows. Grace was in a delivery room, surrounded by Naomi and the medical team. As contractions grew more intense, Andrew was outside, anxiously waiting for the moment he could see his child for the first time. The pain and tension were palpable, but Grace was determined to give her best for her baby. Naomi held Grace's hand, offering words of encouragement as labor progressed. "You're doing great, Grace," Naomi said in a calming tone. "Just focus on your breathing and what you're about to achieve." Grace was breathing heavily, trying to concentrate on the medical team's instructions. "You're almost there, Grace," said the nurse with an encouraging smile. "Just a few more pushes and your baby will be here." Finally, after the exhausting effort, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Grace looked at the tiny being in her arms, a feeling of love and accomplishment flooding her heart. Andrew entered the room, his expression a mix of nervousness and joy. He approached Grace, looking at the baby with a sincere smile. "It's a boy," Grace said, looking at Andrew. "Our son." Andrew took a step closer, his eyes shining with emotion. "He's perfect," Andrew said, gently touching the baby's tiny finger. "I know nothing can change what happened, but I'm committed to being the best father I can be." Grace looked at Andrew, observing his reactions. There was still a part of her that was cautious, but Andrew's sincere gesture sparked a small glimmer of hope. "I hope you're serious," Grace said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Because this is real now, and our child needs a father." Andrew nodded, holding Grace's hand firmly. "I am serious, Grace. I'm ready to take on this responsibility. I'll do everything I can to be present and support both of you." In the following weeks, adjusting to the new life was full of challenges and joys. Grace and Andrew tried to establish a new routine, with Andrew making an effort to actively participate in the baby's life. He helped with sleepless nights, prepared bottles, and made regular visits. Grace watched closely, evaluating Andrew's commitment. His actions showed he was trying, and this brought a sense of relief. Despite her previous doubts, she began to feel that perhaps they could build something positive for the future. One afternoon, while Grace was feeding the baby, Naomi visited to check how things were going. Grace was tired but satisfied. "How are things?" Naomi asked, looking at Andrew, who was on the couch, smiling at the baby. "Actually, it's going well," Grace replied, a tired smile on her face. "Andrew has been making a lot of effort and has been a good support." Naomi looked at Andrew with an approving gaze. "That's great to hear. Remember, while it's a good start, consistency will be crucial. Parenthood is a continuous commitment." Andrew nodded, understanding the importance of Naomi's words. "I know, and I'll keep working to be a good father and partner to Grace." Naomi smiled, giving Grace a quick hug. "I'm here for anything you need, and if you need help with the baby, I'll be around." After Naomi's visit, Grace and Andrew spent some time alone, watching the baby sleep. There was a sense of peace in the room, and Grace allowed herself to relax a bit, savoring the moment. "I know we still have a long way to go," Grace said to Andrew, looking at the baby, "but I want you to know that I appreciate the effort you're making, and I hope we can build something positive for our child." Andrew approached and gave Grace a light touch on the shoulder. "I understand, and I'll do my best to be a present and responsible father. I want our child to have the best start possible and a life full of love and support." Grace looked at Andrew, seeing a sincere reflection in his eyes. Trust wasn't fully restored yet, but hope for a better future was beginning to take shape. As the days passed and the new routine settled in, Grace felt that despite the difficulties and uncertainties, there was a new beginning ahead. With Naomi's help and Andrew's renewed commitment, she began to see a path to a more stable and promising future. The birth of the baby marked the start of an important chapter in Grace's life. With challenges ahead, she was determined to face the future with courage and hope, always prioritizing her child's well-being and seeking a balance between past and present. and as the baby slept peacefully in the crib, Grace felt a glimmer of hope for what was to come.